Welcome to The Right Question. I'm Daphne Gray Grant. Today we're talking about storytelling. I'm answering a question from Susan Osborne from Lafayette, Colorado. Here's what she asked.
Hi Daphne, Susan here from Lafayette, Colorado. Thank you so much for a chance to get my question answered today. I have trouble when I'm looking at starting a chapter, deciding when I go into a scene of a story if it's going to start with dialogue or describing the scene or some backstory. And I feel like whichever one I start with takes me down a different path. And I wonder if you have any advice for what to consider when you're working on introducing a scene and a concept. Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Susan. I'm so glad you asked me about storytelling because not nearly enough non-fiction writers use it as a core part of their process. Stories make writing memorable. Learning how to tell a story well is an important skill for everyone, but particularly for writers. Part of what makes someone good at it is that they have an excellent sense of pacing. This involves not just how quickly they tell the story, but what detail they include and where they begin. I see a great many newbie writers who feel the urge to set up everything before they begin a story. They want to introduce every character, go into all of their backgrounds, and present a summary before they begin. But this information isn't always necessary, and there's a real risk of ruining the impact of your story if you give it. Almost always, the best place to begin a story is in medias res, into the middle of things. This term was coined in Homer's 3 epic poems, the Iliad, the Trojan Cycle, and the Odyssey. All 3 of the stories start in the middle of the action and then jump back to the beginning afterwards. Another example is the novel To Kill a Mockingbird. The book opens with Scout and her brother discussing how far back they'd have to go to explain how he'd broken his arm. The novel then goes back to cover the events that led to this broken arm. When you begin in the middle of the action, you're able to grab the audience's attention almost immediately. Of course, it's easy to start a story at an exciting point when it's all fictitious, but even non-fiction writers can use the same technique as well. Let me read to you from the beginning of the book, The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. In the fall of 1993, a man who had spent much of what we know about habits walked into a laboratory in San Diego for a scheduled appointment. He was elderly, a shade over 6 feet tall, and neatly dressed in a blue button-down shirt. His thick white hair would have inspired envy at any 50th high school reunion. Arthritis caused him to limp slightly as he paced the laboratory's hallways, and he held his wife's hand, walking slowly, as if unsure about what each new step would bring. About a year earlier, Eugene Pauly, or EP as he would come to be known in medical literature, had been at home in Playa del Rey, preparing for dinner, when his wife mentioned that their son Michael was coming over. "Who's Michael?" Eugene asked. "Your child," said his wife Beverly. "You know, the one we raised?" Eugene looked at her blankly. "Who is that?" he asked. I'm not going to tell you how this story ends. You should read the book. It's a good one. But I want you to notice how Duhigg just dove right into the story of a single individual who is having some sort of health problem. We don't know what it is, nor do we know how this story relates to habits. But we all want to know what's going to happen next. It's almost like a thread that can pull us through the chapter. It represents the power of story and the particular power of telling it in medias res. Finally, while we're on the subject of storytelling, let me wrap up with a quote from novelist Greene. "A story has no beginning or end. Arbitrarily, one chooses that moment of experience from which to look back or from which to look ahead." Thanks for your question, Susan. I hope you're able to look forwards, backwards, and sideways as you work to tell your stories.